Hi friends, I've been thinking a lot about list tree map, probably like you have, and I feel like God has been revealing things about the spiritual significance of it to me that I'd love to share with you. It started about in February. I was hanging out with my friend Mariah. She's on Young Life staff in Western Washington. You probably know her. And she told the story. She said that when she was early on staff, she was invited to an intercessory prayer walk in her town with some church people. And to begin the walk, somebody slaps a map on the table. And what they were looking at was a map from people of very dark forces. You know what I'm saying? Like not God's team, like the other team. And what they had done is they had drawn a circle around her town, her community, and were laying claim and curse to it. And so the prayer team just went to town. They started praying, claiming it for God, denouncing spiritual forces of evil and all that stuff. Because I'd never entertained the idea that perhaps the enemy has a map of our town or our area or our community. And it makes me think about the question, who do I want to have spiritual authority over my town? Because in Young Life, we don't talk about this stuff very much. But the Bible is very clear that we are up against spiritual forces of evil. And so it can happen, and it might not be exactly like that. Maybe it's just a spirit of oppression or a spirit of depression or a spirit of disunity or materialism or loneliness or whatever in our communities that we're up against. And so I think our charge here is that we would stand in the authority that God has given us and take spiritual authority over our areas, that we would have a map, we draw that circle, we would lay claim to our communities for God. Because God has called us to our communities and He has given us the spiritual authority to do this work. And I know that some of us have been called to our communities with like the most spectacular, clear way that God has spoken to us, that we understand it as one of the truest things about us is that we're called to this community. We might not know how we're going to raise next year's budget, but we know that we are called to this community. And so if God's called us to our communities, don't you think that He will give us the spiritual authority to do the work that's needed? Of course. Of course He will. In Matthew 28, He gives us the authority. He says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So therefore, go and make disciples." This is where He gives us the authority. "Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I commanded you." And then He says, "Surely I'm with you always to the very end of age." And we know that He sends the Holy Spirit to us to help us in this work. And so I'm saying, stand firm in the authority that God has given you in the area that God has called you to. And this list tree map is not just a great strategy that, oh, I should do it to do a good job. No, you should do it because God's given you the spiritual authority to do it. And when you do it, you're being obedient to Him and you're exercising the authority that He's given you with His power, which you need. One more thing about spiritual authority, and that is this, that it is done when we are closely walking with the Father. In John 5:19, it says, "I tell you the truth, the Son can do nothing by Himself. He can only do what He sees His Father doing." And so I pray that all of us are so in tune with the Father that we would hear His voice, that we would obey. And I'm talking about me too. I gotta be doing this. We would hear His voice before we take a step, because I think that we hear His voice. And it might be like, hey, start club in the next town over, or once you start wildlife, or rally a group of adults around Capernaum or Young Lives or something like that. But we also hear voices that say, are you kidding? Why would you start another club if you don't have your other clubs running smoothly? Or why would you ask that successful adult to be part of your committee? We hear these voices and I would ask the question, does that sound like the voice of God? Or does that sound like somebody else's voice? And it's true. You know, the Father may ask you to put a ministry on pause, or may ask you to slow down, or to marinate a ministry for a while, because we know that the Father prunes. It's not just build, but we need to learn to discern the voice of the Father, because if we are giving into the voice that's driven by our fears and our insecurities, who are we being obedient to? I hope that we are very closely obedient to the voice of the Father. And so this business of map, list, tree, this to me is all about authority. standing firm in the authority that God's given us, but also sharing this authority with our missional community, like giving our committee people authority to go through a list and invite people into the good work that's going on in your community, or inviting some team leaders to make a map of their school and claim it for God, and to be praying over that and asking God to do fantastic things. My prayer for you, brothers and sisters, is from Ephesians 6, that you would be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power, and in that exercise the authority that God has given you for list, tree, and map.